This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you on CGTN. I'm Tian Wei. We begin today's program with an eye on the chaotic transition of power in the U.S. The House Democrats will introduce new articles of impeachment against President Donald Trump on Monday in response to last Wednesday's rioting in the Capitol building by Trump supporters. Rioters forced their way into Capitol, where members of Congress were tallying votes to officially confirm Biden's win. The protesters waved Confederate flags, took away a podium for the House floor, and sat at the desk of Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker. Meanwhile, Twitter also says it has permanently suspended Trump's account, citing risks of inciting violence. In light of the riots and chaotic transition of power, many are questioning the strength of democracy, at least in the U.S. With Biden's inauguration in less than 10 days, what can we expect next? Will he be able to head America's gaping divide? Let's go to our panelists. And in the U.S., we are joined in Boston, Professor Yasheng Huang, who is a professor of international management at the MIT Sloan School of Management. In Washington, D.C., Todd Belt, professor and political management program director at George Washington University. Also in D.C., Peter Kuznick, professor and director at the Nuclear Studies Institute in American University. Last but not least, in Beijing, Huang Jing, dean of the Institute of International and Regional Studies with Beijing Language and Culture University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. I want to start by asking our colleagues inside the United States, impeachment or not, that seems to be still a debate. What can we expect, Professor Belt?
Well, impeachment is a pretty high bar. We know that the Speaker has said that they want to get a vote this week on impeachment, which of course would move it to the Senate, where there would be trial and potential conviction. But the articles of impeachment to move forward to the Senate only require a simple majority, and the Democrats have that. But in the Senate, it would require a 2/3 majority for conviction. The benefit of that, as opposed to the 25th Amendment invocation, which the Speaker has said she's giving 24 hours to Vice President Pence to invoke, the benefit of impeachment instead is that it can disqualify someone from future office holding, which the 25th Amendment is pretty silent on that issue.
I see.
So I don't think that it necessarily will succeed. I think a lot of the senators will say, what's the point by the time it gets to them? But for many people, moving beyond this means holding people accountable for what has happened.
All right.
And that is what needs to start the healing process.
Professor Huang Yasheng, you noted about the party divide between the two political parties in terms of impeachment or not, even though some Republicans are suggesting impeachable, but it does not necessarily mean going to be an impeachment. So, Professor Huang, what's your take about the current situation?
No, I think there's going to be an impeachment. There's not necessarily going to be conviction, and these are two things. Last time Trump was impeached, but he was not convicted because the Senate Republicans didn't go along with it. I think this time around, impeachment is my prediction is it's going to be a certainty. Conviction, as Professor Bell pointed out, is more difficult. By the way, you need not just the impeachment, you need a conviction in order to disqualify him from ever running for public office. So just impeaching him is not enough. You have to convict him. It's unlikely that's going to happen.
What can we learn, Mr. Kuznick, about the party politics between the two political parties, even toward a figure like President Trump? Now the Republicans are pretty much still not criticizing him, generally speaking, while the other party, of course, has been condemning him for a long time. So are we going to see continuation of this, even leading up to the inauguration?
A lot of that depends on what the Republican Party does at this point. You have to remember that leading up to the election, 40% of Republican voters, Trump voters, said they believe in the QAnon conspiracy theory that the Democratic Party is a cult of pedophiles and cannibals who actually abuse and eat children. And they believe that literally. They've been fed 4 years, if not 6 years, of constant lies. And they, even still now, over 80% of Republican voters believe the election was stolen, that it was a fraud. So we're dealing with a real phenomenon in the United States that's quite frightening. You've got this mass delusion going on amongst maybe 35, 40% of the American people. And then Trump, with his incendiary actions and rhetoric, is lighting a match in the midst of all of this. And we saw an insurrection taking place as a result. We've never seen anything quite like this kind of delusional, dangerous, demagogic, insurrectionary activity before.
Now, we see the latest poll numbers. Whether you believe in polls or not, that's debatable, but a latest poll conducted by Sunday by ABC News and Ipsos have been suggesting 56% of Americans being polled suggest that they would like to have the current president being removed from the office, while the others do not necessarily agree. Professor Belt, what do you look at that number?
Well, what's behind that number that's really important for members of Congress is where those people are, right? Because our members of the House represent districts and our senators represent certain states. And so just the overall numbers don't matter quite as much as what the feelings are within the district or the state that an individual senator or representative represents. And that certainly has an influence on how they will be voting or moving forward or not taking action on this impeachment. And you were mentioning about the fracturing of the Republican Party and some of the voices. There should be noted there was a recent video put together by former California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger talking about what recently happened. He, of course, is a Republican. There are other Republicans who have spoken up, Mitt Romney as well. And so I don't think it's just the GOP is being held together. I think it is fracturing, and it'll be interesting to see what happens to it.
A lot of people are looking at the U.S. situation from outside, including Professor Huang Jing now, who is with us here in Beijing. Professor Huang, from your perspective, talking to many of your colleagues and also experts, what is your take of the latest you have seen and witnessed, at least on the TV screen?
I would say that the general understanding of U.S. politics in China is not very deep. And of course, watch the saga with some excitement. And the popular opinion that this is how democracy of the United States is hypocritic and also is almost at the edge of bankruptcy. But I don't think so. I think that all this has reflected a deeply divided nation. And this division is actually, in my view, is unprecedented because it's a division about national identity. Both sides believe the victory of the other side will destroy United States of America as they define. That's why we never see such a divided election. And another unprecedented phenomenon is that both sides are so emotional. And this impeachment, in my view, is the Democrats' continued effort, try to dethrone Trump, not only from presidency, but from moral high ground. And so that they'll carry on this. But to what extent they can be successful, we don't know, because what really has to be watched out, in my view, is 2022 midterm election. That would be a real test point whether the Hill policy will be successful or not.
Right. Is it about Trump or is it about something else? Is it about the system or is it about the current interval of a very unique presidency? This has been a debate, Professor Belt, Professor Huang, and Professor Kuznick, from the very beginning almost of this presidency. So what is your take right now, Professor Huang Yashang?
Well, I think it's more than about Trump. It is about Trump for sure. But let's be very clear about this. Trump is not a product out of a vacuum. He's a product of a specific and growing sentiment in the United States that that the other side, as Professor Huang Jing pointed out, is going to harm us. So in democracy, it is quite important to have some general consensus about the rule of the game, the fair play, and the rules of the competition. And basically, you have a major political party, the Republican Party, that is now does not believe in basic rules of democracy, that doesn't believe in basic facts, that doesn't believe in basic science. Look at how poor the coronavirus has been handled in the United States. And Trump definitely has done a terrible job. But the reason why he has done a terrible job is many people believe in these lies and falsehoods and anti-science ideas. And this is something that is not going to go away after January 20th.
Yeah.
It may actually get worse because increasingly you have this group of people being marginalized. They lost the White House, they lost the Senate, and they don't have the House. So if they don't have proper political representation, it's only going to radicalize these people even more.
Misinformation, political divide, party politics, that seems to be some of the key words in Professor Huang's answer. Professor Belt, do you feel it that way? Is it about Trump? Is it about the system? Or is it about just the party politics?
Well, I agree with both Professor Huang Yasheng and Jing Wang about the fact that this is what we've been calling negative partisanship here in the United States. And it's that people, since roughly the early 1990s, people have determined that they care less about their own political party, they're less tied to their own political party, and they're more mobilized by a dislike of the other political party. And of course, President Trump really just fanned the flames of this problem that has gone increasingly worse over the past 15 to 20 years or so. And he really, he militarized it. He knew how to do it with his Twitter account. So I think how the Republican Party is going to respond to this, as the other professor said in the 2022 elections, is going to be very interesting because if we have two factions of the Republican Party facing off against each other in our primary elections, then I think that's going to be very interesting in 2022 to see what happens with the Republican parties. I should also note one other thing. When we think about the party leaders and the people they represent, there's sort of a two-way interaction in terms of what causes what. Certainly the leaders or members of Congress are elected by the people, so the people choose people who are similar to them in terms of what they believe. And we also know that the districts over time have been more and more what we call gerrymandered, that is drawn in such a way as to favor one party over another. And that has also led to the continued polarization of the parties in our country. And so I think that has made the problem even more intractable.
In other words, if Mr. Belt, I could further ask a bit, does the system work now, given some of the phenomena and symptoms you just mentioned? I mean, this system of two-part political parties, major parties, and the election, electorate system as well. There has been a lot of debate about, do you think there will be a real improvement? What do you think is the systematic problem here with this system?
Well, every democracy, it reflects what the people want. And as some people like to say, democracy is a system where the people get what they deserve because that's what they've asked for. They get the government they deserve. So to say whether it works or it doesn't, it does reflect the people's views. Now, whether or not those in the long run are necessarily the best ideas are yet to be seen. But in terms of when you were talking about the party politics, our system in the United States, as opposed to other political systems, is what's called a winner-take-all and single-member district system, where it is very, very difficult for third parties to have any sort of influence. So if the Republican Party does break apart, would that really fracture the system itself? Not really. What would happen is another party or the party itself would regroup, and we would continue to have a two-party system, which many people think is one of the more effective types of systems in democratic style politics.
Professor Kusnik, now, on the one hand, we've seen the chaos at the Capitol. On the other hand, we also see some suggest that this, what's happening later, and including right now, demonstrates the resilience of the American people. Well, you could always argue both ways, but what's happening is probably even more important than the arguments, isn't it, Professor Kuznick?
If I understand your question correctly, what we're seeing now is an attempt to hold people accountable for what has happened. And in a democracy, it's very important that people be held accountable. This was not some kind of spontaneous uprising. This was planned and organized. We knew about the warnings about the violence and the plans to take the Capitol 4 days beforehand. The New York Police Department, the FBI had warned the Capitol Police. So there was no excuse. And then they came organized. And they weren't just coming there to protest. They were armed, many of them. They brought handcuffs. They brought ties to kidnap people. And we know that QAnon has this idea of this great awakening, and their plan was to actually kidnap the legislators, put them on trial, and execute them. This is in the QAnon's own writings. So we're dealing with a very, very dangerous phenomenon here. We're talking about an incipient kind of homegrown terrorism with a fascist, white supremacist ideology that's serious about civil war and taking over the government. These are not Democrats. This is not the old Republican Party. This is a very different kind of political phenomenon, and we have to deal with it seriously. I'm hoping that the Biden administration, once it takes office, is going to deal with this phenomenon of right-wing domestic terrorism much more seriously than it's been dealt with in the past. There's been a lot of focus on Muslims and other kinds of international terrorist threats in the United States, but the real threat to the United States is this kind of homegrown domestic terrorism, which is planning to kidnap the governor of Michigan, which has been very, very violent. 2/3 of the terrorist attacks in the U.S. in 2020 from these homegrown domestic terrorists.
Well,
and it's a growing and very dangerous phenomenon.
Well, of course, there was also threat against the vice president and also the House Speaker, as we know from the media reports. Having said that, though, Professor Ya Shenhuang, how do you take about, the symptom vis-a-vis the system?
Well, I think it's too general and too broad to talk about system.
Okay.
The simple fact is that this is sort of, in the last 20 years, you got these radical fringe. I think the fundamental problem is that the radical fringe that Professor Kuznick was talking about is being weaponized and being mainstreamed by Trump and the Republican Party. If they had not done that, right, we would have a very different discussion today, and we probably won't have this discussion today. That's issue number one. Issue number two, if you're talking about democratic system, the fact is that lots of countries have democracies, and you don't have these radicalized fringe of the right-wing, mostly right-wing political forces being represented by a mainstream political party, right? So obviously they have done a good job managing that than this country, and they also have a democratic system. Third, if you're talking about system in terms of the specific operations of democracy, yes, US has a lot of problems. Electoral college system is a big problem. Let's keep in mind that Republican Party has not won a presidential election in the last, they won popular majority votes in 1 out of the last 8 presidential elections. If the US didn't have an electoral college system, you wouldn't have the Republican Party controlling the Senate, controlling the White House. The gerrymandering system essentially gave the Republicans, and in the past also gave the Democrats, no competition in their districts. So if we're thinking about the system and improving the system, we're not talking about throwing away democracy. We have to improve the operationalization of democracy to make it more democratic, to make it more rational, and to make it less friendly toward these fringe forces.
Professor Kuzinik, is that going to happen?
Some reform is going to take place. Getting rid of the Electoral College is very difficult. People are coming up with other plans to try to circumvent the very unfair nature of the Electoral College. So a lot of it's going to depend on the effectiveness of the Biden administration. What we've confronted in the United States for the last 40 years is this philosophy that government is not the answer, but government is the problem. And so there's been a deliberate effort to shrink government and to make it less and less effective. We've never been as bad as we were under the Trump presidency, where, as was mentioned before, the United States has now 375,000 deaths from the pandemic, 22 million cases. And the federal government has been so inept in its handling of this that Trump hasn't even mentioned it since the election in more than 2 months, when people in this country are dying at 4,000 a day.
Right.
And so that dysfunction is a part of the problem. I think if Biden gets in there and starts to turn this around, both in terms of the pandemic, in terms of the economy, in terms of the climate change, I think that that's going to be very helpful in terms of restoring some faith in the system that will allow for other kinds of changes.
It seems that Professor Huang Jing, the other panelists have been suggesting there's likely a series of events that's going to test ultimately the quality of the current political system the U.S. at least is having right now. The earlier issue about the transition of power, we have already seen some chaos, and now about the pandemic. Do you think that those will be really the issues that's speaking out about the quality of the current system? Professor Huang Jing, from your observation.
I think President Donald Trump or the entire Republican Party would not have made all of this without some fundamentals that's been changed in the United States as a nation and as a political system. I think that the fundamental problem is this, that globalization has changed the entire world and also the United States. But United States of America as a nation, as a people, as a democracy, have not really adapted to the changes brought about by this globalization, which ironically is initiated by the United States and other Western countries after Cold War is over. So that's why we say a deeply divided nation. It's not just because the political views are different. I think because they define United States of America fundamentally different. One group of people say America is as the way they think that is established by the Mayflower immigrants and their children, and supported by a value system that essentially is consistent with today's what evangelicals support, and should be governed essentially by the white people. And that's why they say the public authority as bad, as evil. That's why the entire constitution, in their view, is to contain the government, contain the public authority. But we say the other side of Americans, another group of Americans who believe that the government is necessary to institutionalize the rights to other Americans, especially the minorities. They say Americans still as a melting pot. They say that the United States is supposed to be multicultural and multi-values and also multi-religious. So they say two different Americans. That's why they have all of this. Fundamentally, I think the democracy has to be adapted to this new situation created by globalization. It is not just one group is anti-globalization, another is for. It is fundamentally, economically, politically, and socially totally divided.
That's going to be a huge task about what the nation is about.
That's why
please go ahead.
Yes, that's why Fukuyama said it's all about political identity.
Professor Belt, address that, please.
Well, I think the globalization issue is really at the heart of what has, to a large extent, really caused some of these fissures in U.S. government and the polarization we've seen when some of the traditional manufacturing jobs started leaving in the 1980s and 1990s in the United States. You saw the Democratic Party move a little bit more to the center. And what Donald Trump has done is he has become a real nationalist, anti-globalization type of president who said that we're going to bring manufacturing back here to the United States. When he was campaigning in 2016 around the Midwest, those states that he won from Hillary Clinton that Joe Biden won back, he said, we're going to rebuild those factories right here. We're bringing it back as it was before. And people believed him, just like they believed that the election was stolen. And so a lot of what we're seeing today is the frustrations of people who have lost work, and the United States economy has not really adapted. We've become more of a knowledge economy and a service-based economy, but that has left a lot of people who were in manufacturing behind.
But on the other hand, Professor Belt, isn't adaptability also one of the qualities of any political system? Be it one system or another. I'm not trying to say one is better or one is worse, but rather the qualities of political systems should be reflected in the level of that adaptability and swiftness of change. Professor.
Well, I mean, one of the things about the United States political system is that it does adapt and it does evolve, but it does so incrementally. That's one of the things we know from this policy studies of how American government works. It's not stuck in one place. It has adapted. It has changed. But when you have one person coming into office trying to appeal to people who are still feeling the pains from 20 years ago, that can put a little bit of a stop to it. But in the long run, I think the course corrections for the United States as a democratic system, it can't change as nimbly as a non-democratic system, but eventually it does get it right, I think.
Let's just talk about the course correction that all of you seem to suggest in the earlier argument. Before that, let's focus on this person, President Donald Trump. He's still the president of the United States. He's not being impeached right now. So I would address him still with that title. After all, he was elected by the country. So what about him and his enablers and the so-called the Trumpism? What is the role, first of all, of a president that is beautifully articulated and defined in the Constitution and also by various laws and regulations? It seems that this president has been able to do things that others would not be able to do and do not even dare to dream of, quote unquote, to do or imagining doing. So Professor Huang Yasheng, tell me more about what is the role of a president? Is it well defined?
Well, I think what we have learned from this entire Trump episode is that a democracy is not just governed by specific rules, specific regulations, but also by norms. And those norms, sometimes we take them for granted because they are being observed, and therefore we don't really think about them every day. Such as you need to disclose your tax returns when you campaign for the president. I thought that was a rule. I thought that was required by the campaign laws and things like that. Only because of Trump did I realize, no, that was just a practice that you could do, that you don't have to do. There's not a specific rule that requires to do that. And there are lots of other examples like that. So what is really important is, I think this goes back a little bit to the sort of how Chinese culture thinks about a leader. We think about leader in terms of rules and things like that. But I think there is a role for morality. There's a role for the character of a leader to be an important criterion in the selection of the leader. I'm not saying that should be the only one, but I believe that the whole Trump experience shows that we have not paid sufficient attention to that. And given that we haven't paid sufficient attention to that, we need to do certain things. One of the things I hope that the Biden administration is going to do and Democratic controlled Congress is going to do is to make some of these things a requirement, right? Disclosure of your tax returns and things like that. and to have a resolution, a clear resolution about whether the president has a power to pardon himself. And that topic has not come up. That may happen next week. Trump may pardon himself, essentially putting himself above the law. And the very fact that is being debated, and the very fact that there are people who feel, oh, okay, he can do that, and there are other people who feel that this is incredible abuse of the presidential power. It's remarkable, right? Because in a normal way that we understand the political system, a president cannot pardon himself, right? So I hope we're going to fix these things and to prevent the rise of a Trumpian-like figure in the future.
It really makes people wonder, what else do we don't know, Professor Belt, about the role of a presidency, the power of him, and how he works with the other political parties and his own, and how much does it mean once he is working for what they consider as the ultimate party interest, they could just assail as much as they want. Professor Belt, how much do we still do not know?
How much do we not know about the Trump presidency, or about the presidency?
About the role of a president as a whole, about how much power a president would have and should have and could have under the current circumstances.
Yeah. Well, when the framers designed the presidency in the Constitution, they did not put very much description in it. They were actually much more interested in a clear description of what the Congress was, because they had a Continental Congress and they knew what it was. They were actually very afraid of presidential power. And so they made Article 2 of the Constitution deliberately vague, and they wanted the presidency to be held by people who would grow into the presidency and establish over time precedents for what should be done to create those norms that Professor Huang Yisheng was talking about that have been so violated by this current president. But absolutely, there is a role for the president as the role has evolved over time from just being a caretaker, somebody who takes care to see that the laws are obeyed, to more of a leader, absolutely the leader of the president's own party. To be, a world leader, right? To broker peace around the world. Also to be a moral leader for the country. Generally, when we ask children in the United States who's the person they look up to most, usually the president is usually towards the top of the list, if not at the top of the list. The president is supposed to represent the best of the country and to act in very moral ways, which is why there was, when President Barack Obama smoked, that was very, considered very controversial. But now we've got much bigger problems about the actions of a president. Yeah. So I think, we'll see things, I think other changes and codification, right, of these norms, right, putting them into law, probably in addition to things such as profiteering off of your business, requiring people to put their financial holdings into a blind trust in reality to do that, instead of just turning it over to the president's sons to run, which is what President Trump did, and perhaps even prohibiting the appointment of family members into high-level positions as well.
Well, if the logic is the laws and regulations are there, including the Constitution, to address the lowest level of human nature, then it seems that has not been doing the job, isn't it, Professor Kuznick, at least in this case?
Well, it hasn't been functioning very well under the Trump presidency, that's for sure. I don't think the founding fathers ever anticipated we were going to have a person like Trump as president of the United States. It still boggles the mind. But there are a couple other things that I think have to be looked at also. And this is one of the ones that's concerned me for a while. Trump still has 10 more days in power. There's been a lot of discussion in the United States of the fact that he has access to the nuclear codes.
Yeah.
This is terrifying.
I know you're a nuclear expert.
Among the powers that Trump has is the power to end life on the planet tomorrow. He has veto power over the future existence of the human species. And the fact that he has that with effectively no intermediaries and nobody else to challenge that is terrifying. Another thing we've been concerned about is that Trump has been eager to have an excuse to attack Iran. And the Iranians have been smart enough to not give him the provocations he's been looking for. But he's threatened that if the Iranian-backed Iraqi militias in Iraq are, if they kill an American, then there's going to be a huge price to be paid. So he has that power. Now that within the Constitution, the Congress should have much more control over issues of war and peace. And I hope that that's something that the incoming administration is going to address also, to return that power, restore that power to the Congress. The authorization for the use of military force in the aftermath of the 9/11 attack is still in effect and still justifies U.S. military actions around the world. There's a big problem with that as well.
Professor Huang Jing, I know world leaders have been expressing their disappointment and attitude of being appalled by what happened at the Capitol in the U.S. over the past few days, and they're watching very closely about whether the U.S. will be able to at least clean its own house and still be playing an important role in the international arena. Professor Huang Jing, what is your observation from this part of the world?
Frankly, I do not believe that the world leaders has lost confidence in the United States of America as a nation, as a democracy. But what really frustrated them and all over the world is that United States, the strongest power on earth, just cannot handle a president who, in James Marty's words, is a playing game of division. We know that if history has taught us anything, any political leader who play a game of division will eventually bring about a disaster, not only to his own people, but to the world. For example, Adolf Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, all of those leaders at some point has played a game of division, and we know the result. So Donald Trump, in my view, is the first president in the history after a civil war that is not playing a game of unity, but playing a game of division. He took full advantage of the deeply divided nation and for his own personal interests. And the problem is, as strong as American institutions simply cannot do anything about it and let him play this kind of game for 4 years, and Trumpism will continue because of it. That's what really frustrated people. That's why people believe that America, of United States of America as a nation, as a democracy, really need to do some reform, really do some, deep reflection of itself to see not only how it can fix the so-called Trumpism, but also can fix all those bugs which has been fully exposed by President Donald Trump.
But the question really is, Professor Jing Huang, with this transition of power, we are going to see another president in the United States, different certainly in personality, but how much capacity he would have in order to change a country where Trumpism, not just Trump as a person or as a president, that is pretty much a dividing factor of the country. How much will be able to do that? And as a result of that capability, how much will the U.S. will put its own self in order and be able to play its role with the others at a time of critical choices about the pandemic, about climate change, and the list goes on. So that is a very interesting question, isn't it? Professor Huang Jing, very briefly before I go to the others.
Yes, I always argue that we see a so-called US-China strategic competition, but the real competition is to see which country can put its house in order first, because the most formidable challenge for both China and the United States are coming from within. For the Biden administration, there are several very formidable challenges immediately after he comes to office. Number one, pandemic. Number two, economy. Number three, a divided nation. How to heal that? But another one, which I have to highlight, is another maybe financial crisis, because after all those pandemic, the Trump administration has pumped over $9 trillion into U.S. economy, which has created a tremendous danger or risk for another 2008. But having said that, let's keep in mind Donald Trump lost the election, but he has won unprecedented 74 million voters. And all those voters, in my view, at least most of them, still very much pumped up. They still believe that the election was stolen. They're going to be there, not until 2022, but until 2024.
Okay.
But about 80 million voters that voted for President Biden or President-elected Biden, most of them vote not for Biden, but against Donald Trump. If 10% of them do not vote anymore, stay at home, there'll only be 72 million. So what really worries me, indeed, is that Biden administration will be one term. That in 2024, Republicans, with Trump or without Trump, will make a comeback. Then United States is in real trouble because we have 3 presidencies, each one of them only one term, left and right, and the United States of America will not have enough time or space to really fix the deep-seated problems that we see today. That's what really worries me. That's why I said, again, 2022 midterm election is a real test point. If Democrats cannot manage this election, then we are going to see a much bigger problem coming in 2024.
Professor Kuznick, it's not just about the U.S., what it's doing with its own economy and the pandemic. It's also about how it's going to deal with the rest of the world because of the internal divide it is having right now. We have seen over the past 4 years harsh damage being done to a bilateral relation, which is arguably one of the most important China-U.S. relations, at least from this part of the world, we see it that way. And therefore, when you say correct the course, which has been a phrase many of you been using over the past 40 minutes, will the next president be able to really correct the course, even on the issue of China-U.S. relations? Of course, there's another issue about the international politics and geopolitics. Putting that aside, this is going to be a very interesting and dear to heart issue for many of us here in this part of the world. Professor Kuznick.
Biden faces several challenges in terms of international relations. He's going to deal with a competitive relation, if not a hostile relation, toward China, toward Russia, toward Iran, toward North Korea. These are all big, difficult issues. Biden has been very forgiving of the Republicans up to this point, despite the fact that they may have wreaked such havoc in the aftermath of the election. He talks about reaching out. Well, I hope he has the same attitude about reaching out to China, to Russia, to other countries to begin anew. The United States once considered itself the unipolar nation and said that it could do what it wanted in the world. Mm-hmm. That's a different world. That world has gone. And we have 2 choices. We can either try to come together as a global species dealing with international problems that afflict us all, pandemics, global warming, nuclear arms proliferation, economic issues. We live in a world in which the richest 8 people have more wealth than the poorest 3.8 billion people. This is a crazy world we've created on this planet. And so when I look at Biden's rhetoric during the campaign, I'm not encouraged. He wanted to out-tough Trump when it came to China. Mm-hmm. When I look at the people who Biden has appointed, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, these are people who basically shaped the Obama policy and Biden's earlier policy, which was in many sense an interventionist policy. Biden has been an interventionist over the years. So there are a lot of things that I don't see the kind of vision that would be necessary to really transform things on a global stage.
I see.
But I think that what's happening in the United States now is a wake-up call. And it makes people understand that we're going to have to start doing things differently, domestically and internationally. Mm-hmm. So while I'm not optimistic about the Biden presidency in that regard, I think there is some glimmer of hope that Biden will take a different course.
Professor Yasheng Huang?
I guess I'm more optimistic than Peter. Essentially, you need to have a reset, and reset not just of relationships, but you also need to have a reset of principles. Now, I'll lay out a few. And I think some of these principles are workable with the new administration. One is that you need to pick your enemy. You cannot, even if you believe that China is a competitive rival, you have to pick your enemies carefully. You cannot take on all your enemies simultaneously, right? So then you have to think, you have to sort through the list, which ones are posing a more serious threat to the United States in the immediate future. And I would argue it's Russia, it's not China. China has its own issues and all of that. But I think Russia is posing a more immediate threat to democracy and to the national security interests of the United States. Iran, I hope they can repair the relationship with Iran, but if they cannot, that can be another problematic country. So in that scenario, you don't want to take on everybody. You want to take on a few and then make friends with others. The second principle is that there are other things that matter to you that would compel you to repair relationship with China. Global warming, public health, right? So these are the issues that whether or not you like China or not, to be rational, you have to cooperate with China. Whereas Russia, Iran, on those issues, they're not that important, right? So the third principle is multilateralism. Even if you compete with China, even if you're, say, contain China, you want to do it in a way that is multilateral, that has the support of your allies. I don't think Europe will go along with you if you go full steam against China, if you just want to hurt China, right? So it has to be a compromise. I think these three principles are reasonable principles, and I believe the new administration would go along with some of those.
Professor Bell, your last words too.
My last words on the international side. I think that President-elect Biden has given a lot of thought to how he wants to reestablish a lot of the contacts and reinforce some of the old relationships the United States has had. He's talked about going on a democracy tour and perhaps visiting NATO in the first 100 days. And I think multilateralism really is the key to help reinforce the idea that people need to work together, both at home and abroad.
All right. You've been watching World Insight coming to you live on CGTN app. We want to thank our panelists helping us to understand their own perspectives on what's going on inside the United States. What does it mean for all of us? Yasheng Huang, Todd Belt, Peter Guznick, and Huang Jing. Gentlemen, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And be safe. Thank you. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on the program.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too, by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head-on. World Insight with Tian Wei go beyond the headlines.
You're watching breaking news on CGTN.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head on. World Insight with Tian Wei go beyond the headlines. And in Singapore now, I'm joined live by Professor Kishore Mahbubani, Distinguished Fellow with the Asia Research Institute from National University of Singapore. Professor, what a pleasure to see you. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
So many things going on in the U.S. over the past week. What is your take of all happened so far?
Well, I would say it would be a huge mistake to try and pass judgment so quickly on what has happened last Wednesday in Washington, D.C., because when the history of the United States is written, and the United States is not a very old country, so less than 250 years old, certainly that date, last Wednesday, will be recorded as one of the most significant dates in American history. Because never before in American history have you had a situation where a sitting president tries to use a mob to overturn a decision made by the people of America and a decision that was about to be confirmed by the Congress of America. So what happened clearly on last Wednesday was very, very shocking. And it will take some time for us to absorb the real significance of that event and also to understand the structural causes that caused this event.
What do you consider as some of the most important issues that you would love to know better about and analyze more about? As you said, we are not doing any conclusion right here, but certainly we could do some quite educated, quote unquote, guesses and analysis. So tell me more about some of the important points that you are watching very closely about how things are evolving around.
Well, I would say that there are a couple of deep structural causes because, you know, what's happening in the United States is because it's such a polarized country now, such a divided country. So if you read the liberal media, all they do is blame Trump. But you cannot just blame Trump alone because at the end of the day, in November, over 74 million Americans voted for Trump. So you got to understand, why did 74 million Americans voted for Trump? And that is the most fundamental issue that needs to be addressed. And I believe the structural causes behind the unhappiness in America, firstly, and this is what I document in my book as China Won, the United States of America has become a plutocracy. Now, what's the difference between a plutocracy and a democracy? A democracy is a government of the people, by the people, for the people. So in democracy, you have a government that takes care of the largest number of people. In a plutocracy, you have a government that just takes care of the top 1%. And this is, of course, the saddest reality of the United States, which many Americans are in denial about, which is that the American political system has been hijacked by the very wealthy. And as a consequence of that, the bottom 50%, and this is statistically confirmed, by the way, the bottom 50% haven't seen their average income or living standards improve over a 30-year period. And that's why there's so much unhappiness among the white working classes, because they haven't seen their livelihoods improve at all, while the wealthy in America are getting richer and richer. But that's only one side of the problem. That's the economic side of the problem. But there's also a cultural side of the problem, which is that, again, the white working classes felt a sense of ownership of the United States of America. And now they increasingly feel, as they're becoming numerically, in a sense, not a majority anymore, but a plurality, they feel that they're losing control of their country. So if you watch the people, if you had seen the television scenes, and I watched the television scenes carefully, the entire mob was white, working classes, white middle classes. There were no blacks, there were no Asians in that group participating in that. And that's also a cultural issue, where the white working classes feel, hey, we're no longer in control of our country. So that's why they went to Congress. They say, I'm going to take back my government. So these are very deep structural issues that have to be understood in depth before you can understand what happened last Wednesday in the United States of America.
Professor Mahbubani, and therefore one would ask whether the system that the U.S. is having right now will be able to address some of those systemic problems that you just said. In that sense, are you confident?
Well, I would say at the end of the day, never underestimate the United States of America, because Winston Churchill said very famously once, he said, you can always count on the United States to do the right thing after it has explored all the other options. And
wouldn't that be said the same about other countries too? I mean, if you look at history as a whole, extending hundreds and probably even thousands of years, that could also be true for every country. And by the way, Winston Churchill said it under a very, very different historical circumstances of his generation,
true.
America.
True. You're right, but the United States has bounced back very strongly from different crises. You remember when Jimmy Carter was president and he spoke about the malaise, M-A-L-I-A-S-E, malaise that was hitting America. There was tremendous pessimism about the future of America. And then you notice how strongly America bounced back in the 1980s after that malaise of the 1970s. So America goes through these cycles, and it is therefore conceivable that it can turn around, but it'll be difficult. I must emphasize this, because of if you look at all the crises that the United States has gone through from the past 250 years, I would say this is bad. This is as bad as the American Civil War of the 1860s, and you can see that this is about as divided as America has been since the American Civil War, because there is no dialogue, no middle ground between the two sides. And this will be clearly Joe Biden's biggest challenge. I mean, he's becoming president of America at one of the most difficult moments in American history. And therefore, it'll be wiser for him to focus on domestic challenges.
So, Professor Mahbubani, what does it mean for all of us? Because what we are doing right now is to analyze the United States from outside, right? As you said, it's now our country, and we could expect different circumstances and possibilities to happen at any moment. But what does it mean for the others who want to still minimize the unpredictability level, who also want to minimize the danger that one country, one culture, and the global trade, that the global pandemic is facing right now? What does it mean to all of us, Professor Mahbubani, watching what's happening?
I would say when you speak of all of us, I would certainly make a distinction between China and the rest of the world, because as you know, there is a strong bipartisan consensus in the United States body politic that the time has come for the US to stand up to China. And there is, as you know, the US-China geopolitical contest has begun, and that's what my book, Has China Won, is about. But at the same time, I would say, I'm told the Chinese word for crisis is a combination of two characters, danger and opportunity. I hope that's correct. The danger for China is very clear, because for China, if the country is angry and people want to distract attention from domestic issues, they try to use China as a distraction, and that's a danger that's real. And you saw, I was very stunned by Mike Pompeo's rather, I must say, erratic decision to lift all restrictions on dealings with Taiwan. That's exactly the wrong thing to do at a time when your country is in trouble. But that's an example of how things can go wrong if angry people are looking for a scapegoat. But at the same time, there's also an opportunity for China today, and I want to emphasize that, because if President Joe Biden decides that his main priority should be to take care of the well-being of the American people, and the best way for America to take care of the well-being of the American people is to cooperate with other countries, with all the countries in the world, including with China. Because clearly the Chinese market is becoming bigger and bigger. And I always cite one statistic, which is very important that all Americans should know. The size of the retail goods market in China in 2009, about 11 years ago, was 1.8 trillion, when the United States retail goods market was 4 trillion, more than double that of China. But by 2019, 10 years later, China's retail goods market at 6 trillion was bigger than the United States retail goods market. So it makes sense for American businessmen to now go back and lobby the American government and say, hey, let's not give up on the biggest market in the world, which is China. So you see, there is a danger in all the problems that are happening in America for China, but there are also opportunities. And I would say for China should give the Biden administration 6 months to settle down and just keep things as quiet as possible, to allow the Biden administration to work out what would hopefully be a sensible and constructive long-term policy towards China in the first 6 months.
But I still want to ask regarding what happened at the Capitol and the uncertain process we're still seeing before the inauguration. What's going to happen to a president that has been there for 4 years, pretty much of a controversy for both his own country and the rest of the world? And also, how is the U.S. political system likely to be readjusted, reset for some of the earlier mistakes that we have all witnessed about it? These are crucial questions for also all of us, I have to say, in the rest of the world. So if you argue there has to be a divide between what's going on in China and what is might mean for the rest of the world, tell me more about the rest of the world. For Europeans, for example, you have seen the statements coming from the NATO president, which is an ally of the United States, an alliance that has been there, never been talking negatively about the country. But you also seen various French, German presidents talking about what's going on inside the U.S. You also see a lot of different voices here in Asia, Professor Bobani. Let's not just brush over as if nothing happened. There's something happened, and people have an attitude, and people want to know what's really going on, because people want to have a future relationship and want to adjust that relationship to the reality of the United States. So, Professor Mahbubani, what does it mean for all of us?
Well, you're absolutely right when you emphasize that the friends of America around the world have been very, very shocked by what happened inside the United States of America. It's absolutely clear they're very shocked, and everybody's hoping that sanity will come back to United States. I mean, that's very, very clear. But when you ask about what's going to happen to President Trump, the answer is nobody knows. Because, I can tell you that when President Joe Biden assumes office on January 20th, he will be very torn, very, very torn between, on the one hand, in a sense, maybe applying the rule of law and saying that President Trump broke some major laws and prosecute President Trump. But if he goes for prosecuting of Donald Trump, the country will become more divided. There's still 74 million people who voted for Donald Trump. So he's got to decide. It's a very, very tough balance. And the best analogy of this is what happened after Watergate. And you know, the Watergate was a big scandal in American history. And of course, his President Richard Nixon's successor, Gerald Ford, could have gone to prosecute Richard Nixon, but he wisely decided to pardon Richard Nixon and close the chapter on that, because you know a prosecution would have been a very divisive move. Of course, that can only happen if President Trump decides to take a back seat and be quiet. But if President Trump launches a new political attack on the Biden administration, which is very, very possible, and if he launches a very, very strong attack, starts new social media agencies, talks at rallies, and makes the country even more angry, then he will leave Biden with no choice but to go after President Donald Trump. But I know these are very, how do you say, hot and difficult moments in American history.
Yeah, what about
and nobody can tell you exactly what will happen.
Yeah, Professor Mahbubani, the other thing people really worry about, if I could just bring out some of the points I talked to the other experts, is whether the U.S. will be consistent about these policies, either internally or dealing with the international agenda. Because we have seen a changing of presidency over the past 4 years. It means total change of approach the U.S. is having toward the rest of the world and toward globalization. So, Professor Mahbubani, if you were there to give advice to various governments, officials from different countries, what would you say? What would you suggest? What is their best bet to deal with the lowest level of unpredictability?
Well, I think the most important advice I would give to all the countries in the world is that it was impossible to have a conversation and dialogue with the Trump administration. Impossible. And the reason why it was impossible to have a dialogue with the Trump administration is because the Trump administration never listened.
But you also said, Professor, you also said it's not just about Trump. It's about the 54 million people that voted for him, right? It's about Trumpism, which is going to be there for a long time. So it's not just about one person. We have to distinguish this one person vis-a-vis what's going on really in the United States.
True, but let me emphasize one key point. I'm talking about the administration, and the administration that wasn't listening. So I can tell you that when Tony Blinken becomes the Secretary of State of the United States of America, he'll be tough, but he will, unlike Mike Pompeo, he will listen. So, for example, if he listens to all the countries, especially the countries in, let's say, Southeast Asia, the countries in Southeast Asia will send a very clear and consistent message to Washington, D.C. We want to have good relations with China. We want to have good relations with the United States of America. And we don't want to choose. We don't want to be caught in between the crossfire. Now, Mike Pompeo would have paid no attention at all to such statements from other countries. Whereas I think, frankly, Tony Blinken, the new Secretary of State, will listen. And certainly, for example, I can tell you that the relations between Europe and the United States will become closer in the Biden administration because there's a far denser relationships between the incoming members of the Biden administration. But at the same time, everything is changing. And this is a critical point. So I was very pleased, for example, that the European Union managed to sign this agreement with China. And that was a very positive development, because in this, especially one word that neither you nor I have mentioned, by the way, which is very, very critical, it is going to be the key word for 2021, this year now, is still COVID-19, right? COVID-19 is, as you know, hitting Europe so badly and also hitting the United States very badly. And if you had a sensible Biden administration, the sensible Biden administration will say, hey, let's stop everything else. Let's pause and just fight COVID-19. And frankly, what you should do, you should have a G20 meeting sometime in the near future, where like after the 2008-2009 financial crisis, just like the G20 meeting in London in 2009 under the chairmanship of Gordon Brown, saved the world from the 2008-2009 financial crisis. What we need in 2021 is a good G20 meeting where the whole world, especially China and the US, come together and cooperate against COVID-19. So, you and I have not mentioned this word, but this is the most critical challenge that the world faces in the first 6 months of 2021.
Yeah. Professor Kishore Mahbubani, Distinguished Fellow from the Asia Research Institute of National University of Singapore. Sir, always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure to be with you, Tianwei.
Thank you, sir. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight or check our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tianwei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching and bye for now.